Hi there, fellow Bonded Book Club readers, subscribers. I'm back for another wonderful Bonded Book Club discussion this month. It feels like it's been like a lot longer than a month since we've all been back together to discuss our beloved books. I don't know why it's felt like that long time. Maybe just things happening in the world makes every day seem just a little longer, but here we are. So today we're going to be discussing Pushout by Monique Morris, and it wasn't a super long read. It was actually, I think, a pretty easy read in my opinion. Lots of really good, chock full of really good information. So a little bit about Monique Morris. If you're not aware of who she is, she has a doctorate in education, tons of professional work in the social justice arena. She's written a lot about the intersection of gender and race and education. There could not be a more perfect person to write this book. She's also a mother of 2 daughters. So Pushout is about and she calls it the criminalization of black girls in schools. And it's basically about policies, internal biases, the structure of our education system, and why that has led to specifically black girls being pushed out of schools. And she primarily focuses on public schools, but that's not necessarily the case because she also kind of looks at some like what she calls alternative schools. So it's pretty much across the board, and why various policies, approaches, and systems that we have created have made it so that it is harder for black girls to stay in school, why they get pushed out of school, why they get like expelled or suspended more frequently, and why that is detrimental and is due to a tremendous misunderstanding of a lot of other systems that are in place. And it's really a call to prioritize in our social justice movements black girls, and how we have not done that in the past, how we focused on a lot of other things, but this is really a call to focus on the specific issue. So in our first discussion, we're going to be talking about a few topics that are sort of like hot button issues recently, especially living in South Carolina. I can only speak about here, but we'll be talking about school resource officers and zero tolerance policies, which have come up here in this state in a national way, not in a positive national way, but definitely in a national way. So anyways, I'll kick off with our first question, which is, so Dr. Morris combines research, statistical findings, and academic analysis with first-person accounts from young black girls to convey the message of Pushout. Do you think that Morris's use of first-person narrative was effective? So in the book, she, instead of approaching, here's a million statistics, here's my approach from the academic perspective, here's a bunch of theories, and she does give you that stuff, like all of that is in here, and she has tons of citations, which you can look at in the back of the book if that is of your persuasion, which I found very enjoyable. But she, instead of going from, going statistics first, she elevates the voices and specific stories of probably like 20 young girls that she interviewed in a lot of different situations. And she uses their specific words and narratives to convey certain points. Instead of putting them in her words, and instead of using just stats to get the point across, she's like, here is somebody who has actually experienced this. Let's elevate their voice to get this point across and to show you that this is the reality for them and that they represent a lot more people than even just themselves. So I thought this was really effective. Not only did that sort of like of course, it's heart-wrenching to hear a lot of these stories. What a lot of really young women are going through at such a young age, having to approach all of these horrifyingly adult issues when they're 11 or 12 years old. But I think it's on a larger scale, it's important because if we're going to have a truly intersectional approach or analysis of an issue, we need to center the dialogue on the people who are actually experiencing these issues. And so she does that. Instead of just coming from, ivory tower academia, she says, let's actually talk to the girls and use their dialogue to make a point. And I found that to be really, really effective and super persuasive and very, very educational. What challenges are created as a result of having law enforcement officials, including school resource officers, present in schools? Do you think the role that they play is appropriate? So school resource officers have garnered a lot of, in my opinion, negative attention in the last few years. We've had, at least in South Carolina, we had a really big case that came out of, I believe it was Spring Valley High School, of a young girl who wouldn't leave the classroom. She was being supposedly disruptive, and a school resource officer came in and body slammed her, and it was all caught on tape, and it was horrifying. It was horrifying. There are many, many documented cases of this across the country. And so Dr. Morris questions the need for police officers to be in schools. And she links this back to a time which she calls like the broken windows theory, the tough on crime era, when a lot of people were panicked about this idea of juvenile super criminals. And I remember during the election, especially recalling even the Clintons using the idea of like a super predator. And this goes back to this era where people were thinking, okay, we need to be really tough on crime because if we don't crack down on it now, it's going to just blossom out of control and we're not going to be able to, basically get it under control. And so as a result, school resource officers have been brought into all of these schools and have become much more, even with children, which is even more interesting and horrifying to me, is that people were even believing that like children could become super criminals. And so obviously that hasn't become the case. But anyway, school resource officers have been brought into schools and have been a lot more involved in basic discipline and stepping in where teachers traditionally stepped in. So, in the past, teachers have handled the majority of the discipline. And this is not to put, all of the blame on teachers. A lot of this is funding, a lot of this is very, very complicated issues, but school resource officers have gotten a lot more involved, and this has led to children, for simple disruptions, for outbursts, being taken out of the classroom, literally, whether that's like you have to go in the hall, and so they're missing out on time in the classroom, or a suspension or an expulsion. And so just because school resource officers have gotten much more involved in the basic discipline of our young children, specifically young Black girls, they have been pulled out of the classroom. And so them not being in the classroom has been detrimental to them. So here's something that Dr. Morris says in the book. She says, the presence of law enforcement has been cited as one of the largest contributing factors to the increased rates of student citations in schools. The increased surveillance of Black youth in particular has led to increased contact with law enforcement and in some cases, the juvenile court for actions that would not otherwise be viewed as criminal, even if they violate school rules. The presence of law enforcement in schools has instead blurred lines between education and criminal justice. So she gives numerous examples in the book about literally like 6-year-olds being handcuffed and taken off by police officers for having meltdowns. Pretty normal things for a 6-year-old, even for an 11 or 12-year-old, and how these, normal, somewhat outbursts for children have been literally criminalized, and we've now involved law enforcement into the discipline of children in schools. And on top of that, when you're looking at kids who have history of trauma, who've been living in impoverished situations, like, none of this is going to benefit them by pulling them out of the classroom and by subjecting them to increased violence or situations that could even trigger underlying trauma. So anyways, Dr. Morris in her research has examined that having school resource officers has not corrected the problems that they hoped to correct in schools. In fact, it has led to more children not accessing schools, to having more contact with law enforcement, and to being criminalized at a younger age. Our next question is, what role has the increased prevalence of zero tolerance policies in schools played in pushing out Black girls from the education system? So this is how Dr. Morris defines zero tolerance policies, another pretty hot button issue right now. Zero tolerance policies are rules and practices that emerged from the broken windows policing theory. It suggests that small criminal acts are indicative of more severe negative behavior that may later manifest. The idea is that by not tolerating any infractions, they are mitigating future, possibly worse consequences. So, zero tolerance policies were ignited by this consciousness and school discipline ethos that supported the removal of students from classrooms if their actions were perceived as defiant in any way. In many cases, this quashed student voices and limited the ability of teachers and administrators to use discretion and to use the skills that they have learned as teachers to handle their students in a way to make sure that they are staying in the classroom and they are continuing to learn and not being pushed out. And teachers have also, it has limited the ability of teachers to respond to unique situations, such as children who have lived through trauma. And police officers are not trained necessarily to deal with kids who've lived with trauma. Zero tolerance results in choices and decisions based on fear and punishment, not on personal accountability. So, it's this one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with challenging students in schools. And it's this idea of conforming, that you need to conform to the situation. It's not considering cultural issues, it's not considering poverty, and it's certainly not considering trauma, and it's not considering the effect of mental illness on a lot of these students. So it's a one-size-fits-all, and it has disproportionately affected students of color, particularly young girls, in public schools. And when you involve police officers in schools, this has led to them being pulled out of classrooms. And the thing is that even when students she talks about this in the book, is that when she has spoken to many students who've had, quote, outbursts, or a lot of the times they're just asking too many questions, that was another one, that they want to be there. Students understand the importance of education in their future and in finding jobs and in maybe pursuing more education, but they're children. And, they're responding oftentimes to a lot of situations that maybe even teachers or certainly school resource officers are not accounting for. And so Dr. Morris is really, in this book, is calling for a more multifaceted approach to how we handle discipline in schools. That this is not a one-size-fits-all, that we need to be accounting for girls who've lived through trauma, who've lived through poverty, who've lived through a whole bunch of shit, and we need to be tailoring our discipline and approach to them. Because if we really do want them to succeed, if we do believe that education is something that everybody should have, throwing a bunch of kids out in the hallway, suspending or expelling them is not giving them a high quality education. That's, one size fits all. I'm not going to try and think about this. That's the easy approach. She's saying we need to have a multifaceted approach to discipline, to keeping kids in school, and to approaching the trauma that so many of them have experienced, and ensuring that even kids who've experienced trauma or a lot of economic or social barriers can still access education and can still benefit from it. Because I think that everybody acknowledges that education is very necessary to operate in this world. And, we need to be able to tailor our approaches to many students, not just the students who are, the easiest to educate and who have not been through trauma and challenges in their childhood. So another topic that Dr. Morris talks about in the book is Black femininity and the, quote, Black girl attitude stereotype. Describe harm in perpetuating the Black girl attitude stereotype from the perspective of the teacher and then also from the perspective of the student. So Dr. Morris says in the book, she says, the popular perception of Black children as unruly, incorrigible, or inherently ungovernable has affected society's conscious and unconscious responses to Black girls who get in trouble with the law. Black women and girls are subject to the masculinization of their behaviors if they challenged authority, asserted independence, or attempted to mitigate their impoverished and sometimes violent physical environment by striking back. So something that she talks about a lot in the book is that these young women are oftentimes trying to defend or establish some amount of personal and human dignity. And I feel like that's a really important undercurrent. They have often been through so much, whether it was just economically. She talks about many of these girls experiencing mental illness or even like sexual violence at a very young age. Sex trafficking is much more common than I think anybody would like to admit in this country. And all of that is not acknowledged when people like to paint a very easy stereotype across a wide swath of people. And that's just too easy. It's too fucking easy, people. Like, that does not acknowledge everything that these young girls have been through. They're children. Can we talk about that? They're children. Something she talks about in the book is how the Black girl attitude stereotype not only does it sexualize young girls, which is really, really, really messed up, but it paints them as adults. And so by painting young girls as adults, that makes it easier for teachers, administrators, and school resource officers to justify criminalizing a lot of normal teenage behavior, and also normalizing maybe pulling them out of school and placing them into other systems of confinement, whether that be, juvenile prison, or whether that be like other various places that oftentimes girls are put in, like various homes or whatever. She talks about a lot of different types of confinement that girls get put into, not just prisons. But by treating or by viewing young Black girls as like adults instead of as children, because of these types of stereotypes, it makes it easier for people to not think twice about what we're doing. So, like I was saying, this idea of like a Black girl attitude stereotype, not only does it just sexualize young girls, but it paints them as adults. It paints them as disrespectful, it is violent, it dehumanizes them, and it ultimately leads to their pushing out of schools because people perceive them as adults, they perceive them as choosing their fate, as choosing to be like this, as choosing their circumstances and bringing it upon themselves. Okay, so this is our first video, first of 5. We are done with our first video. Sam will be coming up here shortly, and then I will be back not long after that. So I hope you'll stick with us and enjoy this conversation, especially if you've read the book. It's an awesome book. You should definitely check it out if you haven't. Otherwise, I will see you in an hour.